Welcome to ChurchPulse Weekly. It is as usual. I'm joined by my cohort partner in crime, David Kinnaman. Welcome, David.
Hey, Carey. How's it going, man? I'm joining you from Colorado today, so recording today's, yeah.
So Toronto, Colorado. It's amazing, this technology thing. Hey, it works.
I think it's going to stick around.
Hey, we got a little milestone we passed to on the podcast too. Want to thank everybody who's been with us. Some of you from the very beginning. We've been trying to throw you a lifeline week after week here on ChurchPulse Weekly, but we just passed 500,000 downloads. Isn't that crazy, David?
That's really astounding. And thanks to you and your team and to the whole team at Barna and our friends at Glue, who were the ones who first thought that we could respond to the pandemic. I think we had a podcast within a week or 10 days after the quarantine hit, and boy, it's been quite a journey. But what a journey! And thanks again to listeners who have joined us for any part of this journey.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing, telling your team, sharing this on social media, emailing it out, texting links to friends. That's what gets you to 500,000 downloads. And we're just grateful. If this has helped in any possible way, we try to bring you practitioners, academics, respected voices that have something to say, because the last couple of years has been chaos. And we're trying to bring a little bit of order and a little bit of perspective into that chaos. So in a few minutes, we're going to hear from Jay Kim and Ben Windle, and we're going to talk about discipleship online versus discipleship in person, which has been a big subject of debate over the last few years. How to rethink your space. They've got some really interesting things to say about that. How to blur the lines between church and your community, and ways that digital is great for marketing, but not really the product. So we'll get into that in a little bit. This is part of the Making Space series that has we are partnering in with the Aspen Group, and you can go to the aspengroup.com/churchpulse if you want to learn more about that. But David, we've also got some statistics, some research that I would love for you to share with leaders about what's really going on in the hearts of the leaders and the people that we serve.
Well, one of the things that I think is most important for us to pay attention to today is what was before the pandemic, but was really accelerated by the pandemic, and that is loneliness and the degree to which people feel loneliness intensely. And a colleague of ours is releasing a book called The Loneliness Epidemic, Susan Metis, and it's about this very trend, how these were things that were already in the making before the pandemic, and then how the pandemic has really accelerated and affected loneliness. It's made it, the contrast for those that are with others, that have connected networks, and then and those that don't is bigger than ever. And I think everyone feels loneliness. I know certainly leaders tell us they feel lonely often, and so this last year I think has accelerated and amplified that feeling of loneliness for all of us, whether we're local church leaders or just people we're serving in ministry. So one of the stats is that 1 in 3 Americans, 36%, said that they feel lonely at least a few times a month. The numbers are almost identical between Christians and non-Christians, 35% versus 39%. And, I think the degree to which the church can sort of step to the plate and talk about loneliness, use language that helps people point towards a different and better way in and through their church communities is a really healthy step forward. And when we talk about mental health and anxiety and depression and dealing with aloneness, those are really deep questions that I think we as leaders need to be wrestling through to be able to answer that for ourselves and then for those around us.
Yeah, what about church relationships? We did go through a season where everybody was shut down, everybody pivoted to digital. What are we seeing there, David?
Well, only 57% of churchgoers said that during the pandemic and some of the things that came out of that in terms of worship, only 57% said that over the last year they were able to stay connected to the people in their church. So just over half. I think that's too small a number. I think it might be part of the reason why so many people ended up dropping out. And it's actually much lower than the percent of Christians who said that they have been able to stay connected with friends and family who live nearby. That was at 75%. That also makes sense. I mean, during the pandemic, we kind of drew closer to those closest to us, both physically and familially. But again, I think that the church as the family of God, like too big a percentage of people ended up feeling relationally disconnected during the pandemic.
And then we're sort of emerging into an era where I think most of us would think hybrid church is the default model for church moving forward. But there is the question of whether people really want just purely digital church. And the answer seems to be no. Is that what you're seeing in the data?
Absolutely. Practicing Christians who we've interviewed, only 8% said they want primarily digital worship going forward. Now, that's not an insignificant number when you think that's 1 in 12 people, and that's an expectation for many people that will be sort of here to stay. But 38% said they would want both digital and physical options for worship. And then 54% of practicing Christians, just over half, said that they're going to prefer primarily physical gatherings in the days to come. Those are stats we've covered in the past on this podcast. But I think they still point to this sort of at least 3 stripes of Christians. Those that are sort of physically oriented, physical worship oriented, those that are digital worship oriented, and those that are kind of hybrid. And just recognizing that it's going to be a little bit different sort of profile, vibration, set of interests, and how is it then that's hitting people as you're developing programming and preaching and other kinds of outreach and discipleship efforts. As we've said, there's so much opportunity for more one-on-one, relationally oriented, relationally close-knit ministry, I think, coming out of this season of ministry and going forward. How are we going to do that? How are we going to architect that? How are we going to design our physical spaces, our digital gatherings, even the ways we think about, whether we're program-driven or relationship-driven. A lot of churches say they're small group-driven, which is sometimes true, but a lot of times that's actually it's sort of an easy cop-out.
It's just good language.
Mm-hmm, yeah. And so just taking a really deep dive and assessment, kind of a holistic audit of what you're doing and how you're doing it for those different kinds of expectations people have, but all towards this sort of central goal of not just getting people to be a part of your church, but to really disciple them in a way that helps to transform them in the way of Jesus.
Well, if I can, I know we've shared that stat before, and I've blogged about it too, but if I can just offer a little editorial comment on it, it might be really comforting to say, just slightly over half of all practicing Christians say they strongly prefer in-person to hybrid or digital only. But that accords fairly tightly with the return to church attendance that we're actually seeing. So on the one hand, it's easy to hear that and go, see, most people want in person, but it's slightly half of people want in person. And then we look in our rooms and it's half full. And we're like, oh, wait a minute, that's what that actually looks like. I don't know. Is that extrapolating too much from the data?
I think it's a fair observation. Yeah, that we've sort of been commenting. I've been observing that this idea of the people that have dropped out of church, just that weren't that into church at all, and it became just really easy for them to come to attend either virtually or less often, or to drop out entirely. So we don't know that those who are not in the room are sort of part of that group of people that are just more likely to prefer digital only or hybrid church. But I think your observation is really right on. Like to the degree that we're just comfortable with the new status quo may mean that we're not willing to actually bend into the new ways God wants us to think about this. And I think we've made this sort of false dichotomy, and we've actually been talking about this since almost day one. Like, what is the promise of digital? What's the perils of digital? Why do we need to have in-person embodied? I think if you look at a lot of the data, people who are really well connected in person may still be very lonely, right? And people who may be very physically active coming to your church often may still actually be spiritually inert. So, Jesus always looks at such deeper issues. It's sort of like, you've heard it said that those who attend physically and worship, then, but God is looking for those who will worship in spirit and in truth. And so I think that should always be the kind of metric that we look for is, the opportunity to sort of move people towards these deeper places of relationship with each other and intimacy with Jesus.
I really enjoyed the conversation with Jay and Ben, and what I thought Jay was going to say, and I was wrong, being the author of Analog Church, is, well, you got to be careful of digital. But I think what's really interesting is both of them fully embrace a model of hybrid church. So we're going to get to them in just a second. Jay Kim serves as the lead pastor of teaching at Westgate Church in the Silicon Valley of California and teacher in residence at Vintage Faith Church in Santa Cruz, California. He's on the core leadership team at the Regeneration Project, where he co-hosts the Regeneration podcast, and he is the author of Analog Church, which was released last year of all things. And Ben Windle is an author, pastor, and life strategist and Barna contributor. He has worked both in the ministry and business sectors and founded Life Place Church with his wife in Brisbane, Australia. He's passionate about helping people develop resources that equip the church to develop generational intelligence in reaching millennials and Gen Z. So now to my conversation with Jay and Ben. Well, Jay and Ben, welcome to the podcast. It's good to have you both.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so we've been talking about the hybrid church model out of necessity in large measure for the last 18 months, right, as the world went kind of crazy. But both of you have emphasized through your writings and your teachings the idea that in-person gathering isn't just preferred, it's actually an essential way to do community. I'd love each of your takes on that. Why is in-person gathering so essential? Jay, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say here. I think one of the thoughts that comes to mind for me as I think about digital, and I'm a fan of digital. I think that's kind of a misunderstanding a lot of people have about.
Well, as the author of Analog Church, I can understand how that would be misunderstood. And everyone, for the record, thinks I'm only in favor of digital church based on my writing, which is also not true. But that's right. Fair enough. Let's get the stereotypes out of the way.
Yeah, that's right. I think one of my concerns is that digital, as helpful and beneficial as it is, has a way of sort of, without us knowing it, uprooting us a little bit from place. Digital is really interesting, social media in particular, because we have a tendency to think about digital spaces as actual spaces. And in some ways they are, but they're so fast. I mean, I can swipe and click and, just up and down scroll so quickly that there isn't a sense of rootedness in anything. And I think it's one of the values of the digital age is speed. And, Walter Brueggemann wrote like almost 20 years ago about this in this book called The Land. And he talks about how like our current crisis is a crisis of rootedness. That without being rooted in a place and amongst a people, it's really difficult or impossible, he would argue, to find meaning. And so I think a lot of people talk about the crisis of meaning, but I think the crisis of meaning in many ways is connected to a lack of rootedness. So there's a healthy way to use digital for sure, and social media as well. But I think sometimes that's where digital falls short, and it can actually uproot us in ways that we're not even aware of. And I think being in person, analog, the slower pace of actually showing up to a place has a way, it doesn't solve the problems, but it has a way of at least mediating a life that is more, it leans more toward rootedness amongst the people and a place.
That's a really helpful context. I don't know whether either of you have read Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. Fascinating book, hard to get your hands on these days, but I listened to the audiobook a couple of years ago, and he died like, 15 years ago. He died a long time ago, wrote the book, I think in the late 80s, early 90s, but he makes the argument of the TV age and traces it, like he basically says, we were rootless with the TV age. We have all this disembodied information coming at us at unprecedented rates. We don't know what to do with it. It's making us stupider. And he actually traces it back to the telegraph in the mid-19th century, that was the first time in human history where information that didn't have a local in-person context started to be shared, and it kind of changed culture, not always for the good. So fascinating. Ben, how about your take on that? The last 18 months and missing in-person gatherings, why they're so essential from your perspective?
Well, I appreciate the conversation with yourself, Carey, and NJ, because I think we are at an inflection point of having a discussion about this. As I've been pastoring through the last 18 months, I think it makes you look at a deeper way regarding how we define what community is. And the digital age is here, and technology has given us all a new way of life. And in many ways, it has improved our lives. I think for my generation, millennials, it has also burned a hole in the fabric of our culture that we have to address. And what that has done is it has amplified a deep need for real community and friendship. So I think more than anything, it presents the church with an opportunity to be a unique part of meeting this need right now, in our generation and in our culture.
Well, it's interesting. You guys wouldn't have this data, but just to share it with you, one of our partners at Barna and my own company is Glue, the technology firm out of Colorado. And I've been on some calls with them in the last few weeks, and they've been running social media campaigns in 4 or 5 major cities in America. And it's surprising to me, but far and away, the top 2 needs that people who don't go to church are articulating is, I want prayer and I'm lonely. Like, that is the felt need. Now, of course, that's being expressed over the internet. How do loneliness and things like prayer, you can definitely do virtual community, but I just love your take on that with, in terms of in-person gatherings. How important is that, and how essential is that to help cure problems like loneliness and just this need that, does anybody care? Would somebody pray for me?
Let me give you 2 statistics, Carey, on this, because they tell a story. Gen Z spends an average of 7.3 hours on their smartphone every day.
Wow.
79% of this generation say that they are lonely. So we've got an uphill battle to say online is curing that or good at community. And so I think with everything going on the cloud, high tech, there is a search for physicality, and a longing for simple things, even such as a meal, Yeah.
I've heard similar stats, and I love that, Ben. I do think that the 2 dance together, and I like the way you said it, that this actually offers us an immense opportunity. A lot of people have said this, but I think digital, actually, one of the great benefits of it, it's given the church specifically a unique and a uniquely broad front door. And that's an opportunity that I think we have to lean into. But if you think about your home, you think about, your family life and your home life, the reality is the front door is a place it's an entry into more intimate and meaningful spaces. And that's a bit of what I hear there. I think digital gives us that opportunity, if we can leverage it to invite people, again, to something as simple as a literal meal, and metaphorically sort of to dine at the table of God together with his people. And for me, I was just about a month ago, I was standing in the NICU of a local hospital about 15 minutes from where I live with a young couple who asked me to come and visit because they were saying goodbye to a child that the wife had just given birth, and because of some complications, the child wasn't going to make it. And so we were dedicating this little baby to the Lord. She lived for about 48 hours and then went to be with Jesus. And, I thought a lot about that. Like, I would not do this over FaceTime. And that sounds pretty obvious. But in the most important, meaningful moments of life, whether in mourning or rejoicing, every fiber of our body and bones tells us, like, I got to be there. I mean, if this couple was going through this situation in New York, I would hop on a plane and fly 5 hours to be there with them. And if you unpack that further, based on some of that data that you were sharing, Carey, loneliness feels like a death to people. I mean, and literally it leads to death. I mean, some of the statistics bear this out. And pastorally, I think that sounds like a great challenge, but it's also an opportunity, and undeniably it's a calling. So the more we can lean in physically embodied into the real lives of real people, the more I think the Spirit of God can do the work that only he can do.
So a bit of a personal question for each of you, and I'll share a little bit. This is like, I don't know if there's any stat that can back this up or whatever, but so we have Brisbane, Australia, San Jose, California, Toronto, Ontario on the line here on this podcast. Okay.
Cool.
So we were all not the fastest ones to come out of the pandemic. Fair enough. California, Australia, Toronto, we'd be on the slower side. So our church just reopened like 6 weeks ago. And I remember, first of all, it was great to be back. And I've been in the building a ton because of my role as founding pastor, but it's different when you actually have people in a service. And I remember seeing an elder I haven't seen in 18 months. And the hug we gave each other in the parking lot was like, I've known this guy, brought him on as an elder, like deeper than anything we've ever experienced. And last night I threw a dinner party in our backyard. We did some renovations, had some really like 1 decade, 2 decade friends over, and like nobody went home, even though it was a work night, doctors and CEOs and everything. And everybody just stayed until almost midnight, and we just seem to be clinging a little bit deeper to the in-person because it was taken away from us. Similar experience. Are you seeing that, or is that just like weirdness? What do you think?
It's certainly true where I live. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, our spaces have turned into lingering spaces, and it's been a profoundly beautiful thing. We've been gathering in person now since April, so we're about 4 or 5 months in, something like that. And one of the most encouraging things for me as I think about kind of the pace of life here in the Silicon Valley is that it hasn't worn off. It's been about half a year since we've been
Wow.
in person, but Sunday after Sunday and in our small groups, and my wife hosts once a month sort of open play date for young families in our church at a park. On the advertisement, it says like 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. People don't leave till their kids are just crying because they need their nap at 1. It's a profoundly beautiful thing. And I think it speaks to just like you're saying, that longing, that hunger that we have. And I've been encouraged because it hasn't worn off in about 4 or 5 months. So that's
I wonder if it's going to be shaping like the Depression was. I'm old enough to remember people who lived through the Depression. Certainly wasn't my generation, but the people who would keep aluminum foil forever because you never know, and who always had savings and they didn't believe in debt because they remember the Depression. Ben, like Brisbane, the Gold Coast, that area is not quite as tight as it's been in Sydney or Melbourne. But what's your observation of how people are approaching in person where you are?
Well, it would have some of the warmth of both of your stories, which I appreciate. I think maybe we've taken for granted in-person community, and that's taken away from you. There's a fresh appreciation. In my context pastorally, it's also created another dynamic. I would call it an unintended consequence, where you have some people that are returning. And yes, that's great. Yes, let's linger. Yes, let's enjoy each other. But there's a lot of people that haven't returned. And so I think it creates questions over why and what that looks like over a long enough timeline in terms of online, in person. And I would say a part of the nagging concern, Carey, would be something as simple as this. Have our new, beautiful, sophisticated online options enabled dad to water the lawn at home with his cell phone in his pocket as he listens to 5 minutes of the live stream. And I think that there are elements of that. That's not the story of everybody, but again, I think there are elements of that where there are some people that really missed it and they're back and they're like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. And then there are other people within the church world where it's another story.
Yeah, I appreciate the honesty of that, Benjamin, and there's that meme like, oh, I don't know whether I'm ready to quite return to church yet, given all the variants and everything. That's the Sunday morning answer. Saturday night, they're at a party with like 5,000 other people, right? So, there's a little bit of that going on under the surface as well. And we all kind of laugh and we all kind of wince when we see that. So let's think about physical spaces moving forward. Has this conversation, which I think has already been rich, is that framing how you think about what physical spaces are needed and also what you do in those spaces when people return and connect?
Well, I know I'm asking a crucial question, which is this: what does in-person experience provide that online cannot?
Yes.
And how can I embrace that? So let's be honest. Here's what online can do really well. You can listen to great preaching and worship, or let's wrap all that up and just call it content delivery. I can get it any time of the week, whenever I want. In many ways, it's a superior way for me to be able to grow through getting content. But what can people not get online? They can't get a great coffee. Barna revealed they desperately missed physical sharing of communion. So I think foyers and cafes are the new auditoriums. Places, like Jay said, that help people linger longer. Food, things that keep people. And if you want to reach millennials, young parents, yes, us millennials are older than what you think, invest in kids' areas.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I think lingering spaces for kids, one of the most profoundly beautiful things that's happened at our church, and Benjamin's kind of the expert in this area, but with with emerging generations, so many of them, we have 2 services on the campus where I'm sitting right now. And there's this whole community of them, like dozens and dozens of them, who come every Sunday to our 11:15 service. They go off campus to buy whatever lunch they want. There's a bunch of restaurants around here. And instead of eating at these restaurants where the seating is limited, they come back to our campus and sit all around our lawn and in our tent area. And they'll be here till 4 or 5 in the evening. They'll set up, spike ball, and like, it's a wild thing. And they don't schedule it. They don't ask for the space. They just come back. And so it's triggered our thinking, where for us, our leadership team here, we're trying to figure out ways to create more of those sorts of lingering spaces, not just for those who call our church home, but for our city, 7 days a week. So I agree. I completely agree with Benjamin. I think the more we can think about our spaces as gathering spaces for the lonely masses in our towns and cities, the more beautiful and effective the mission of the church is going to be as we head off into the future.
If you were building today and money was not an issue, so 2 hypotheticals. Okay. If you're building today and money was not a big issue, how would you design your space differently moving forward, knowing what you know now?
Yeah, I mean, for us, I think it's one of the things we're attempting to do. We would try to create, and are going to try to create, much more communal spaces that are open 7 days a week. Lingering spaces, big open spaces with seating for many. We would really try to blur the lines, I think, between, church, like where the line is drawn between our church and our town or our neighborhood or our city. We're in a very unique part of town here where there's sort of a convergence of shops and restaurants and a little bit of American suburbia and neighborhoods. And so we try to centralize and invite as many as we could, again, to linger here. We're really lucky. Our worship center actually is not as big as it could be. So that which was once an issue for us is something that feels like an opportunity. It's just a much more intimate space. So I'm of the opinion now that I would much rather have to have more services on a Sunday and gather people in more intimate spaces than one big, giant, large thing where it's easier to be anonymous. And that's not a knock on churches with large spaces. I think there are unique ways to create intimacy in large rooms as well. So those are just,
I think the footprint was already moving to smaller and more rather than bigger and fewer. If you think about the 6,000 seat auditorium, I think that day has come and gone in most cases. But, that idea of, well, we'll do 3 services with a room that seats 400, and that's how we'll reach 1,000 people, was already the trend prior to the pandemic. And some of that was financial as well. It's just like there's a limit to budget. Cities are expensive. Benjamin, if you were building today and money wasn't an issue, is there any way you'd be rethinking space right now?
Well, if money wasn't an issue and you were going to come and help me fundraise for it, Carey, then let's go.
In our theoretical world, it's not an issue. So what are you doing?
Let's do food. Let's put a coffee roaster in the foyer. I mean, let's do things like what do people gather around throughout the week? They gather around food. They gather around that point of connection. So yes, if I was budgeting, I would put a third into the auditorium, a third into my foyer and cafe spaces, and a third into my kids' areas. That's a rough portfolio of how I would budget facilities.
And the Aussies do coffee really well. If you've never been there, they talk a very serious coffee game and also a live one too. So yeah, it's interesting, which is very New Testament, right? Like food is in almost every chapter in the New Testament. It shows up. It's the communal meal. Ironically, and we haven't talked about this on the show, a lot of churches are hesitant to do food because, we're worried that, maybe it'll spread COVID or that kind of thing. And yet we're pretty sure that's not how it spreads. Any thought on that, on local? And I know that there's a million different restrictions locally and countywide and statewide and nationally. Any thoughts about safety and food and community and gathering?
Yeah, we were just having a conversation about that this morning about donut holes and how much people miss donut holes, and our donut holes were not that good to begin with. So it's a funny thing what nostalgia will do in terms of your memory. Yeah, I mean, for us here in the Silicon Valley, things are pretty tight when it comes to food for organizations like the church and large gatherings. So we're trying to navigate some of that stuff. One of the ways that we've sort of worked around it, and it's actually worked really well for us, there is a growing sort of food truck culture and scene here. And so that's, we're not serving anything. It's a way for us to love our local businesses. So we've been able to forge some really healthy and beneficial relationships that way. So that's kind of our starting point for us when it comes to food. We've just had food trucks come out for different things on Sundays, again, to invite people to linger. You don't have to go home for lunch, hang out, grab some food, sit on our lawn and spend some time. And then we'll see where it goes from there.
Yeah. Ben, any thoughts on food in a pandemic? We've done the food trucks as well, almost every Sunday, I think, since we reopened.
It's a great idea. I guess some of those restrictions are so localized and specific to an area. But I think as maybe the way I would word it is, as things open back up, the more freedoms that we have to do that kind of thing, I think the better.
Appreciate the nuanced conversation. Let's talk about the pros and cons of discipleship online versus discipleship in community. I've done an interview with Nikki Gumbel for my other podcast. And, Nikki was firmly opposed to doing Alpha online prior to the pandemic. And then necessity is the mother of invention. They start Alpha online. And I mean, they're doing it both online and in person. But he said there have been things that have worked online that just would never work in person, and other things that are working really well in person. What is your take on digital discipleship versus in-person discipleship? I know that's a whole podcast right there, but Ben, we'll start with you.
Well, David Kinnaman talks about digital Babylon. And I think to reach digital Babylon, you need digital discipleship. I also like the quote that by Christian Lewis Lang, that technology is a useful servant, but a dangerous master. Yeah. And I think where we can boldly innovate in the space of digital discipleship, we should, and pursue it. We don't get to choose as the church whether or not we're going to be a part of the digital revolution. We're in it and we're late to the game. So we must. I think where we can find in-person community touch points to wrap around our digital discipleship, it only enhances. It's a complement to discipleship, because at the end of the day, discipleship is not knowledge transfer. It's not information. It's a relational, communal experience. So I think that both can go hand in hand if we know which bucket to put what in.
Jay, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I agree completely. I think that is a helpful sort of distinction to make between information, content, which is a critical part of any sort of journey of growth. I think a lot about the gym. I have a friend who used to be the general manager for CrossFit and the CrossFit Games. His name is Justin Berg, good friend of mine, went to our church for many years. And he had this wonderful saying in describing CrossFit, which is like this global phenomenon now,
Oh, yeah.
and he says that CrossFit, the magic was in the fact that people came for the fitness, but they stayed for the family. That's what he would say. And he talks about his whole job was marketing this massive movement. And really, the marketing was digital. And digital was perfect for marketing CrossFit. I mean, you just think about the high intensity workout, sort of the visuals of CrossFit. Even if you don't do CrossFit, you can imagine, like CrossFit, friends who do CrossFit and just how all in they are. So it's like designed in a way where digital was this really beautiful, powerful, effective way of getting CrossFit into sort of the social consciousness. It piques interest. It was even a way of getting the information and really the inspiration out there. You'd watch these little promo videos. You're like, man, I don't want to just look like that. I want to be a part of a community like that. Look at those people. They're like all in together, cheering each other on. Then what's really profound about CrossFit is they never really recently a little bit, but they never really put the majority of their energy on like, hey, buy our CrossFit video or do our CrossFit online curriculum. What they said was, we've got CrossFit gyms all over the world. Check it out at home, like watch the videos, do some of the stuff if you want to. You can find some videos on YouTube, but when you're ready, come join us in the gym. People would, and they come for the fitness, but they stay for the family, because there's something different about the experience of transformation when it's side by side, shoulder to shoulder with other people who are going through the pain with you. And that's what's fascinating. It hurts, it's not comfortable. It's not easy. And so it is with Christian discipleship. I think in sort of the late modern Western world, with our consumeristic approach to things, we expect becoming like Christ to be easy, to be packaged in a neat, sort of easily accessible way. And the reality is we need to make it accessible. But when you really get into it, you realize following Jesus is about taking up a cross, and it's really hard. And because it's hard, we need one another. But more than the fact that it's hard, it's just like by design, it's a communal experience. And so I think that dichotomy, that distinction is really important. I think digital, again, like we've been saying, is here to stay. We don't decide whether or not we're in the digital age. We are in it. And so churches need to lean into that and make that clear in their approach. What are we going to do digitally that is effective digitally? That's content, information, inspiration. And then through that, what are we inviting people into? Some of the transformational communal stuff that you really need some other people kind of shoulder to shoulder with. So I think making those distinctions and then leading in that way is going to be critically important moving into the future.
So a few years ago, you released Analog Church, and I'm sure a lot of leaders have read it. But for those who haven't, can you tell us what the point of writing Analog Church was about and a couple of the key highlights? And then the follow-up question to that, Jay, is, so you wrote that pre-COVID. Now that we've been through what we've been through, would you change anything? Would you update it? Would you put an asterisk beside anything? I'd love your take on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, we released Analog Church 3 weeks before everything went on lockdown here.
There you go.
Silicon Valley. I wrote the book primarily because I grew up in the Silicon Valley. Almost all of my family, and the majority, it sounds crazy, but the majority of the folks who call our church home are 1 or 2 degrees of separation removed from tech. I mean, the majority of our folks work in tech. I mean, we're right now from here, I'm 10 minutes from the main campus of Apple, 15 minutes from Google, 20 minutes from Facebook. I mean, it's all right here. So I've always just been fascinated by technology, by the digital age and digital culture. And several years ago, our church went from being one church in one location to a multi-site church. We adopted the video venue model, which really worked for us at the time. but I began asking questions like, is this the best way forward? I didn't feel like we asked enough questions. We just adopted the model because it was the model handed to us. And so that led me on a long path of, first and foremost, sort of questioning my own, digital addictions, and then asking questions about the digital age and the intersection between that and our ecclesiology. And so I just wrote the book mostly to help church leaders ask the questions that maybe we haven't been asking enough. Why are we doing what we're doing? Are there some ramifications that we haven't thought about? What's good about this? What's not so good about this? Is this what the Bible means when it talks about church, or is it not? So that's kind of why I wrote the book. And the second question, Carey, I've been asked that question a lot recently. I don't think I would change anything about the book. I have readily and very, very publicly admitted, though, that when I wrote the book pre-pandemic, I definitely did not have the level of gratitude and appreciation that I have now for digital technology. It's hard for me to imagine the past 18 months without the technologies we have. We would have made it work, but man, it is hard to imagine how even more disconnected we would have been without some of the technologies that we have. And I'm not just talking about online church and Zoom, although those have been helpful. I'm just talking about like simple things like FaceTime and the ease with which we were able to just send quick, text change for prayer and communicate over social media. So I have a greater appreciation, but more than anything, I think the last 18 months have sort of affirmed some of the convictions I share in the book.
Well, I mean, going back to February of 2020, I don't think there's too many leaders who honestly would have predicted that we would lose access to our facilities for months or a year or longer. At that point, I think that would have been inconceivable. And so that's a really good point. Ben, you're moving a little bit away from what I understand from the language of hybrid ministry, and instead talked about this aspirational model and omni-channel ministry. Can you tell us more about that and how you're thinking about ministry moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think the language of hybrid makes sense. Seeing it play out during COVID, it's helpful, in my opinion, to add some layers to how we define community. And I think that's so crucial. If we don't embrace digital, we will lose the two new generations that we must reach, millennials and Gen Z. But if we capitulate to it and we give into consumer-driven or preference-based Christianity, we can lose our effectiveness. And I think when you ask the question about digital and community, it changes based on the generation. So for me, I was born in, an analog world. And I went through the digital revolution. Yeah, but speak to a 25-year-old and ask them, can you do community online? They'll be like, oh, some of my best friends I've never met. We play gaming together and talk every day. So I think that there are massive generational differences within this. To me, the nuance when it comes to the hybrid model is about how we describe where we feel we are most effective at different elements of our church. So I think it is within reason for a pastor, if the pastor has this conviction, to be able to say, there are aspects, not the whole picture, but there are aspects of how you can grow in community that are best achieved in person, and then map out what those elements are. I've mapped out 3 ingredients, which to me, at this point, and that may change with more innovation, more technology, but at this point, they are best achieved in person.
And what would they be?
Well, that's a good question. There's one word I'll put in front of you, but I'll give you the 3. They are, number 1, interpersonal responsibility. These words directly for me, I speak them into my own generation and younger generations. You need this. You need interpersonal responsibility. You need institutional physicality, and you need inconvenient hospitality. And really, there's one word out of all of those 3 that really captures what I'm trying to say. You need inconvenience. And I'm not sure true community begins until it's hard and challenging and inconvenient. But that's a part of what makes our church community so special and rich. Like, I'm a pastor's kid. I've been around church my entire life. I can honestly look back and say, it's not just through the most pleasant experiences or the nicest people in the church that I grew. It's through the giving and the sowing of myself in and the sacrifice and all the reality of what goes into an inconvenience that has helped me grow. So if our definitions of community are based on this, do that which is most convenient, and we map that out over 10 years, is that growing people in the same way, where we are actually leaning in, not coddling them, leaning in and actually challenging them and saying, there's a version of community that you've maybe never discovered, but if you embrace it, it will be a catalyst for your growth.
That's a fascinating thought line and conversation, because I think, according to some of the data I've seen, our ability to be willing to be inconvenienced and have the hard conversations and deal with the difficult people seems to be dropping as the years go by, but also among generations too, which is fascinating, but that really resonates what you're saying. Okay, final word for pastors from each of you, for pastors who are just trying to navigate that space between digital and analog, the real world, the virtual world. What would you say to them as they move forward and we all try to figure this out together? Jay, how about you?
What Benjamin just said reminds me of that really famous quote from Bonhoeffer in his book, Life Together. I'm just paraphrasing here, but he says that, those who love their dream of the Christian community more than the community itself, unwittingly essentially become destroyers of that community. And this calling into inconvenience, I think, begins for us. It begins with us, as those who feel called and compelled to serve and to lead in the local church. I think we all had dreams before the pandemic. Then the pandemic disrupted everything. And then we crafted new dreams. Here's what's going to happen in the pandemic. And then the pandemic starts changing and it starts ending and restarting. And then we have these new dreams about what's going to happen with our church. And then we get disappointed because our church doesn't look the way we dreamed. And maybe not as many people came back as we had hoped, and all those sorts of things. So I think the one word I would just humbly offer to those men and women who are called to serve and lead in the local church is, don't love your dream of your church, just love your church. And that includes those who are making the courageous decision to show up week after week now, and those who, for whatever reason, are staying online, and those who maybe have left and moved on or whatever. Like, what does it mean for us to love the church that God has given us to steward and to serve, to care for, and to shepherd? I think that is the primary question. And if we can answer that question well, what is the most loving? And love sometimes means, to Benjamin's point, not making it comfortable for folks, but actually lovingly call them to discomfort, to inconvenience, to sacrifice. I mean, that's the way Christ calls us. And so it means all of those things. And I think if we can do that, then, as choppy as the waters may seem, by God's grace, we'll weather the storm, because God has led the church through pandemics before. He's led the church through world wars and famine and chaos and uproar, and here we are. And so that would be my encouragement. Love the church God has given you, and faithfully lead and steward and shepherd that community, and all will be well.
Oh, that's great. Okay, Benjamin, you are actually publishing a white paper with Barna soon, so watch for Benjamin Windle as you move forward. But I'll give you the final word, a word for leaders as they try to navigate the future.
Thank you. I've so enjoyed and found the conversation enriching. Where I stand right now, I'm looking at half of my church returned. Wow. And half that I'm trying to regather. I would say to pastors, I feel you. I stand with you. We have some big decisions to make in front of us, and offline and online should work together in a complementary fashion. But the proliferation of online over the last 18 months has combined with this trend of staggering rates of loneliness. And that provides us with a unique window of opportunity to be the desperately needed solution, the need for real human connection and community, however you achieve that. So where we can embrace creating community, I think maybe unlike any other time, at least in our lifetimes, but in history, the need for community and connection is at an all-time high.
Well, can't thank you enough. Benjamin, Jay, thanks for being with us today. Well, David, I guess the future is hybrid. That's what it sounds like.
Well, there's lots of discussion and ongoing one, but what a great conversation with those guys. I'm such a huge fan of Ben and Jay, and glad we got a chance to learn from them today.
Well, and I think, in some of the other work I do, I always get, oh, you're the online church guy and people want physical. Well, of course they want physical, but life is this slipstream between in real life and the digital. Like, we're hanging out right here in this space, but in a couple of weeks, you and I are going to see each other face to face. That's just the way life is.
Yeah, and it's something I've observed for a long time, going back to some of my themes on studying discipleship with emerging generations, that, I say a lot of churches are doing dial-up ministry in a Wi-Fi world, and we don't have the bandwidth on an hour and a half, a week to convey all that God wants for us and how to disciple people and all the rest. And we have this huge dropout problem of millennials and Gen Z. I think part of the problem is we haven't embraced the opportunity of living in that slipstream and doing both physical and digital ministry. So even if our physical in-person ministry is very strong, we also have to have the opportunities to disciple people across the whole of their life, Monday through Saturday. In the moments when they're Googling, like the questions to the deepest problems that they face and some of the most mundane issues that they face. And, being able to be the church in all those spaces is, to me, just such an incredible opportunity that I think I'd love to see, the Christian community, Christian leaders sort of move beyond physical versus digital, because it feels like a false dichotomy of, like most people are living physical and digital lives. How can the church show up in force for that? And I think we just learned a lot from this interview today about how to do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is definitely a world where both exist, and the church has an opportunity to play in both spheres. So, hey, if you are thinking about your physical space moving forward, if you were intrigued by some of the ideas, and there were some great ideas in the interview today, check out what the Aspen Group is doing. You can go to aspengroup.com/ChurchPulse to check out our partnership with them. And as you rethink maybe remodeling your current space, repurposing it, with church being different moving forward, a lot of you are doing that. And for those of you who are planting, who are building, make sure you check out the Aspen Group at aspengroup.com/ChurchPulse for more. We're back next week with a fresh episode. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks for helping us get to 500,000 downloads. We're looking forward to doing a lot more. And if this episode has meant something to you, please share generously on socials. Leave us a rating and review. We're really grateful for you. We're in your corner, and that's why we do this. And we'll catch you next time